The blaring sirens cut through the joyful music like a knife as Eli stood at the altar, his heart pounding not from nerves, but from the sudden dread. "They can't stop us now," he whispered to George, who squeezed his hand tightly, the mayor's secret life about to explode in front of the entire town. Sunlight poured over the backyard of the sprawling colonial home on Maple Lane, turning the white chairs and scattered rose petals into a scene of pure promise, but the flashing red and blue lights racing down the quiet suburban street shattered everything in seconds. Eli Thompson, 43 years old, mayor of Riverton, Ohio, had spent years building a reputation as the steady family man who fixed potholes, balanced budgets, and waved at every parade while keeping the most important part of himself locked away. Today, that lock was supposed to break open forever, with George Ramirez at his side, the 36-year-old high school art teacher who had quietly become his everything over the last 3 years. They had planned this small gathering carefully, only 30 close friends and family, no press, no fanfare, just vows under the oak tree and a simple reception afterward. But the neighbors had other plans. Across the hedge, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, 62, and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood values, had watched the setup all morning, the rainbow-colored ribbons, the two grooms' tuxedos, the same-sex couple kissing and greeting. She clutched her phone, her voice shaking with righteous anger, as she dialed 911. "Officer, there is an illegal gathering happening right next door at the mayor's house. They are trying to have some kind of perverted wedding, and it is disturbing the peace. You have to come stop it now." She hung up, satisfied that she was doing her civic duty, never once imagining that the tall man in the black tuxedo, waiting at the altar, was the same mayor she had voted for twice. Inside the house, Eli paced the kitchen one last time, checking his reflection in the window, his dark hair neatly combed, his broad shoulders tense under fabric. George came up behind him, wrapping strong arms around his waist. "You sure about this?" Eli asked softly, his brown eyes searching for any hesitation. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," George replied, but his voice carried the weight of every whispered argument they had shared in the dead of night, about timing, about his re-election campaign, about the teenage son from his previous marriage who still called every Sunday, expecting stories about Dad the mayor and not Dad the man in love with another man. The first guests arrived, smiling, hugging, offering congratulations, but the atmosphere shifted when a patrol car pulled up at the curb, followed by 2 more. Officers stepped out, hands on belts, scanning the scene. "Who is in charge here?" one asked, his tone already edged with discomfort. Eli stepped forward, his mayor instincts kicking in even as his stomach twisted. "I am. This is a private ceremony on private property, officer. There is no disturbance." The cop squinted, recognizing the face but not quite placing it yet. "We received multiple complaints about public indecency and noise violations, sir. We need everyone to disperse." George moved to Ellis' side, his hand brushing Ellis in silent support. "This is our wedding," he said calmly. "We have every legal right." The neighbors had gathered now, a small crowd of 10 or 12 faces twisted in disapproval, murmuring about sin and tradition and what the children would think. Evelyn Harper shouted from her yard, "You people are ruining this street with your agenda." Eli felt the familiar burn of shame he had carried since college, the same burn that had kept him silent through 2 terms in office, smiling through family dinners where his parents praised his bachelor status and hinted at grandchildren. But today he refused to let it win. He turned to the officers, his voice steady. "I am Eli Thompson, mayor of Riverton, and this is my home and my wedding. Please respect that." The officers exchanged glances, one of them paling as the realization hit. "Mayor Thompson, sir, we do not know. We are sorry for the interruption, but the calls came in, and we have to respond." The word mayor rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Evelyn Harper, clutching her pearls, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. The mayor himself. How could he? Eli felt George's hand tighten on his, the silent promise that they would face this together, no matter the cost. But deep down, Eli wondered if love could survive the storm they had just invited. He had spent years weighing every decision, the late-night strategy sessions with his campaign manager, the careful avoidance of any photo that could be twisted, the quiet dinners with George in the basement to avoid prying eyes. His parents back in Columbus still believed he was too busy for relationships. His ex-wife from a brief college marriage had remarried and moved away, taking their son with stories of a father who put duty first. George had been patient through it all, his own family in Chicago more accepting, but still worried about the backlash that could splash onto their son too. Now the choice was made public and irreversible. As the officers radioed for clarification and the neighbors pulled out phones to record the scene, Eli pulled George aside under the oak tree. "Whatever happens next, I choose you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. George nodded, tears glistening but not falling. "Then let's finish what we started." The officers lingered uncertain now that identity was revealed, but the damage was already spreading faster than any siren could chase. The backyard fell into an uneasy hush as guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering support, others staring at their phones, already leaking the news to local group chats. Eli led George back to the altar, determined to salvage the moment, but his mind raced through the years that had brought them here. They had met at a charity auction 3 years earlier, Eli presiding as mayor over a fundraiser for the town's new youth center, George donating a painting that captured the riverfront at dawn. Their eyes had locked across the room, and something clicked, a quiet understanding that neither had ever felt before. Over coffee the next week, George had listened as Eli confessed the weight of the closet, the fear of losing the trust of voters who saw him as the safe conservative choice, even though his policies were quietly progressive on housing and education. George had shared his own scars from coming out in college, the lost friendships, the family dinners that turned cold. Their love grew in stolen hours, late drives, to the next county weekend hikes where no one knew them. But the secrecy carved deep grooves of doubt. Eli remembered the night 6 months, and when George had asked him point blank, "Are we ever going to stop hiding?" and Eli had snapped back, "You don't understand. What my job demands, the town needs stability, not scandal." The argument had ended with George walking out, only to return the next morning with flowers and a promise to wait. Now standing under the oak tree with police lights still flashing faintly in the distance, Eli felt every one of those arguments replaying. His campaign manager Marcus had warned him just last week that rumors were circling the opposition was digging for dirt ahead of next year's election. Marcus had been a friend since college, the one person besides George who knew the truth, and even he had urged caution. "You built this image, Eli. Family values hard work. Don't throw it away for one day." But Eli had chosen the day anyway, because George's patience was wearing thin, and the love they shared felt too real to keep buried. Guests began to settle back into seats, a few offering encouraging smiles, but the neighbors had not left. Evelyn Harper stood at the property line, arms crossed, her husband beside her holding a sign hastily made from cardboard that read, "Protect our children." The officers conferred among themselves, one approaching again. "Mayor, we have to ask that you keep the noise down and limit the gathering to avoid further complaints." Eli nodded curtly, his jaw tight. "Understood, officer, but we will proceed with our ceremony." George squeezed his hand again, the gesture grounding him. As the officiant, a longtime friend from the city council, cleared his throat and began the simple words, Eli felt the internal storm rage louder. Was he selfish for dragging George into this spotlight? Was he betraying the voters who had trusted him with their schools and streets? Or was the real betrayal denying who he was every single day? He stood at podiums preaching unity while living a lie. Flashbacks hit him hard during the opening remarks, the family barbecue last summer, where his parents had grilled him about settling down, his mother saying a mayor needs a wife to host events. "Eli, you are not getting any younger." He had smiled through it all, changing the subject to the new library project while George waited 3 states away, sending secret texts of encouragement. His brother Derek, the golden child with a perfect wife and 3 kids, had once joked at Thanksgiving about Eli needing to man up and find a good woman, the words landing like punches because Derek suspected but never said it outright, choosing instead to enable the hiding. George's side was different. His sister had met Eli twice in secret and hugged him fiercely, whispering, "You make him happy, that's all that matters," but even she worried about the toll the secrecy took on her brother. The officiant asked if anyone objected, and the silence stretched heavy until a voice from the hedge called out, "I object, this is wrong." Evelyn Harper again, her face flushed. The officers moved to quiet her, but the interruption had cracked the fragile peace. Eli turned to the crowd, his voice rising with controlled anger. "This is my home and my life. I have served this town honorably for 6 years, and today I ask for the same respect I have given you." George stepped forward, his calm demeanor a contrast to Ella's fire. "Love is not a disturbance," he said simply. "It is what holds communities together." Some guests clapped, but the neighbors booed softly. The officers finally retreated to their cars, promising to monitor from the street, but the tension remained thick as molasses. Eli pulled George close for a brief moment before the vows, the warmth of his partner's body reminding him why the risk was worth it. Yet in that embrace, he felt the first real crack of fear. What price would they pay for this honesty? And would their love survive the bill when it came due? The vows began under the watchful eyes of both supporters and critics, the officiant reading from a simple script that spoke of commitment through storms and joy in everyday moments. Eli went first, his hands trembling slightly as he held George. "George Ramirez, you walked into my life and showed me that strength is not in hiding, but in standing beside the person who makes you whole." I have spent years balancing duty and fear, but today I choose you without reservation. No more secrets, no more half-truths. Tears welled in George's eyes as he listened, the weight of 3 years of patience finally acknowledged. When it was his turn, George spoke with quiet intensity. Eli Thompson, you taught me that leadership means more than titles. It means living your truth so others can find theirs. I have watched you carry the town on your shoulders while carrying our love in silence, and today I stand here proud to call you mine, whatever comes next. The rings were exchanged, simple platinum bands that caught the sunlight like promises made real. Guests wiped eyes and clapped, but the applause was cut short by another commotion at the edge of the yard. Evelyn Harper had rallied more neighbors, now 15 strong, some holding signs, others filming on phones. One man, a retired accountant named Harold, shouted, "This is an insult to every traditional family in Riverton. The mayor should be setting an example, not breaking the law." The officers returned, looking exasperated but bound by protocol, to address the growing disturbance. "Sir, we may need to shut this down if it escalates," one said to Eli, his tone apologetic now that the mayor's identity was confirmed. Eli felt the moral tug-of-war inside him. Part of him wanted to invoke his authority to clear the street. The other part knew that using power to silence dissent would only fuel the narrative that he was above the rules. George leaned in, whispering, "We fight fair, remember." That reminder steadied Eli. He addressed the crowd again, his voice carrying the authority honed from years of town halls. "I respect your right to disagree, but this is a private celebration on private property. Any further interference will be handled according to the law." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Some neighbors backed off, but Evelyn remained rooted, muttering about calling the city council. Inside Ellis' mind, the conflict deepened. He thought of his son from the college marriage, now 17, living with his mother in another state, and the careful phone calls where Eli dodged questions about dating. The boy idolized his father, the mayor, but what would he think when the news hit social media? George's family had been more supportive, his mother texting earlier that morning with heart emojis, but even they had cautioned against a big public step too soon. The betrayal that hurt most was closer to home. Marcus, his campaign manager, had texted during the ceremony, "Be careful, boss, this could sink us." Marcus, who had known for years and profited from the image of a single straight mayor, now seemed ready to distance himself. As the officiant pronounced them married, the kiss was brief but full of years of longing, yet even in that moment, Eli tasted the bitterness of what lay ahead. Guests hugged them, offering congratulations, but the air crackled with uncertainty. One friend pulled Eli aside, whispering, "The local paper already has a tip, someone leaked it." The realization hit like a punch. Marcus, or one of the neighbors, or both. Eli turned to George, his new husband, the words still foreign on his tongue. "We knew this could happen," he said, "but the price feels higher now." George nodded, his eyes fierce. "Then we pay it together." The reception began with toasts and cake, but the joy was shadowed by the police presence lingering at the curb and the neighbors watching like hawks. Ellis' parents had not attended, citing a sudden illness, but he knew the truth. They had guessed and chosen avoidance. The internal voices screamed at him, selfish or brave, coward or hero, the lines blurred in the face of every decision that had led here. As twilight settled over the backyard, string lights flickered on, casting a soft glow that should have felt magical, but instead highlighted the divisions. Tables were set with simple fare catered by a local restaurant owned by a supporter, but conversations were hushed and glances darted toward the street where more neighbors had joined the watch party. Eli circulated among guests, shaking hands, accepting hugs, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moral calculus of his choices. He had entered politics young, fresh out of law school, believing he could make a difference without sacrificing his core, but the closet had become a cage tighter with each election. George stayed close, his presence a quiet anchor, reminding Eli that the man beside him had sacrificed promotions at school to avoid rumors that could link back to the mayor. During a quiet moment by the punch bowl, George confessed, "I never minded the hiding until it started making you doubt us." Eli pulled him into a hug, the gesture drawing a few cheers and a few scowls from across the hedge. The officers had left after filing a report, but promised to return if calls continued. Then the first family bomb dropped. Ellis' brother Derek arrived unannounced, his face the mask of fury. "What the hell, Eli?" he hissed, pulling him aside away from guests. "Mom and Dad are beside themselves, and now the whole town knows. You are the mayor, for God's sake, think of the family name." The confrontation escalated quickly, Derek accusing him of betrayal of the values they were raised with, Eli firing back that love was not a value to be ashamed of. George stepped in calmly, but firmly, "This is not the place, Derek, we can talk later." Derek stormed off muttering about consequences, but the seed of family fracture was planted. Eli felt the guilt wash over him, the same guilt that had kept him from coming out to his parents years earlier when they had arranged blind dates, and praised his focus on career. Meanwhile, George's sister called for Chicago, offering support but warning that social media was already buzzing with the story hashtags like Mayor Out and Riverton Scandal trending locally. The betrayal deepened when Marcus finally arrived late, his smile forced. "Boss, we need to do damage control immediately. The opposition is already drafting statements about hypocrisy." Eli stared at the man he had trusted with his secrets. "You leaked it, didn't you?" Marcus shook his head too quickly. "No, but I warned you this would happen." The lie hung between them, another crack in the foundation Eli had built. As the night wore on, guests began to leave, offering hugs and promises to stand by them, but the real test was coming. Eli and George retreated inside the house, the backyard now quiet except for the distant murmur of neighbors still gathered. Sitting at the kitchen table with half-eaten cake between them, they talked deep into the night. Eli confessed the terror of losing the election, the fear that his son would reject him, George sharing the ache of feeling like a secret for so long. Their decisions had consequences, each one a trade-off: love for safety, career for authenticity, family harmony for truth. The internal awakening began there in the quiet recognition that hiding had cost them more than they admitted. But the storm was only beginning as phones buzzed with incoming messages from reporters and council members demanding statements. Morning brought the full force of the revelation. Local news vans, parked along Maple Lane, cameras trained on the house. Eli woke to George's arm around him, the warmth a brief shield against the chaos outside. They had barely slept, the conversation from the night before still echoing. Today they faced the town together. The first call came from the city council president demanding an emergency meeting. "Mayor, this is unprecedented. We need you to address the concerns." Eli agreed to attend, but insisted George come with him as his husband, the words still new and powerful. At City Hall, the room was packed with reporters, residents, and a few supporters. Evelyn Harper sat in the front row, her face set in determination. Eli stood at the podium, his heart steady for the first time since the sirens. "Yesterday, my husband and I were married in our home, a private celebration that was interrupted by prejudice. I have served this town faithfully, and my personal life does not change my commitment to you." Questions flew fast. "Did you lie to voters about your lifestyle?" one reporter asked. Another from the opposition, "How can we trust a mayor who hid such a fundamental truth?" George stood beside him, silent support, but when a council member suggested resignation, he spoke up. "Hiding was a mistake born of fear, not deceit, but love is not a lie." The confrontation escalated when Ellis' parents appeared unexpectedly, his mother in tears, his father stone-faced. "We raised you better than this, Eli," the father said publicly, the words cutting deeper than any reporter. Derek stood with them, nodding in agreement. The family betrayal stung, but it forced Ellis' awakening. He realized the price of their approval had been his soul. Back home, more neighbors protested, now with signs and chants, but a small group of supporters counter-protested, creating tense standoffs. One neighbor, a young mother named Sarah, approached Eli privately later that day. "I don't agree with everything, but calling the police on your wedding was wrong. Thank you for standing up." The gesture gave hope amid the storm. Internally, Eli wrestled with the right and wrong of his secrecy. Had it protected the town from division or created it? George faced his own crisis when his school principal called, suggesting he take leave to avoid distracting students. The sacrifices mounted, each decision rippling outward. The media frenzy peaked by midweek, national outlets picking up the story, framing it as small-town prejudice versus personal freedom. Eli and George held a joint press conference on the steps of their home, Eli announcing he would not resign and would run for re-election on a platform of inclusion. The decision came after hours of debate with George, who urged him to consider stepping back for their marriage. "I can't hide anymore," Eli said, the awakening complete. But the cost was immediate. Donors pulled funding. Marcus resigned, citing irreconcilable differences, the betrayal confirmed in a leaked email where he had tipped off a reporter. Family lines hardened. Ellis' parents stopped answering calls. His son sent a text full of confusion. "Dad, is this real?" George comforted him through the night, their bond strengthening in the fire. Confrontations continued. Town hall meetings turned heated, with residents debating morality and leadership. One older man stood up, shouting, "You deceived us." Mayor Eli responded calmly, "I protected myself the same way many of you protect your own secrets." The words sparked both applause and boos. Eli faced a moral dilemma when the city attorney suggested a quiet settlement with protesters to calm tensions, but that would mean apologizing for the wedding. He refused, choosing integrity over peace. George sacrificed a gallery showing he had worked years for choosing instead to stand publicly beside his husband. The trade-offs were real and painful, yet in each choice they found clarity about what mattered most. Weeks turned into a tense, new normal. Protests dwindled, but the social fabric of Riverton remained torn. Eli attended council meetings with George by his side, facing whispers and occasional outright hostility. His internal conflict resolved into resolve. He began pushing policies for LGBTQ youth programs, the very issues he had avoided before. Family reconciliation attempts failed at first, but a surprise visit from George's mother brought tears and tentative acceptance. Ella's son called, finally the conversation raw and honest, leading to plans for a visit. The betrayal by Marcus lingered, but Eli chose forgiveness, understanding fear drove many decisions. Deep talks with George revealed the root of their strength: mutual respect for each other's sacrifices. The climax came at a public forum where Evelyn Harper confronted Eli directly. "How do you sleep at night knowing you lied?" Eli answered with quiet power, "I sleep knowing I finally told the truth, and that truth is making this town better." The room erupted in mixed reaction, but the tide began to shift, some neighbors apologizing, others remaining firm. By the time autumn leaves fell over Riverton, Eli and George had settled into a life no longer hidden. Eli won re-election by a narrow margin, a campaign a testament to resilience and growth. The couple hosted a community open house, inviting neighbors, including Evelyn, who came hesitantly and left with a small smile. Family wounds healed slowly. Ella's parents visiting for Thanksgiving, the conversation awkward but honest. George thrived at school, his students inspired by the story of courage. The sacrifices had been steep: lost endorsements, strained relationships, public scrutiny. But the awakening was profound. They understood that love demanded honesty, and that honesty reshaped the world around them. Standing on the same backyard where sirens had once interrupted their vows, Eli kissed George under the oak tree, the sunlight warm and full of promise. In the end, was it morally right for Eli to hide his relationship with George for years to protect his career and family, or should he have come out earlier despite the risks, true or false?